Hey homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Thanks for joining me in my kitchen. Today I am making some canned salsa. And this is a small batch recipe, so I thought it would be a good one to do a video on, because if you're brand new to canning, if you're new to salsa making, this one only makes 3 pints. And so it's kind of nice to get your feet wet with a recipe without committing to a huge amount, only to find out that, I don't really love that recipe. It's not really my favorite. This one is a Pico de Gallo, and what makes it interesting is that you don't peel the tomatoes. That's very unusual for any kind of a canning tomato recipe. There's a certain amount of bacteria that is just found on the outside of tomatoes, and so in order to reduce the general risk, they almost always tell you to peel your tomatoes, regardless of what you're doing with them in terms of canning them. This recipe does not. This recipe just lets you leave the skins on. So that also makes it a nice, easy beginner recipe to get started with. We are going to be using paste tomatoes in this recipe. You will also hear them called Roma tomatoes or sauce tomatoes, and they're just a little bit drier. So they are not quite as juicy, and generally when you're making a salsa, it's nice to work with a paste tomato, because otherwise you end up with a salsa that you really kind of have to drain some of the liquid off of when you get ready to eat it, because it's not very thick. And they tell you not to drain that liquid before you make the salsa if you're just using regular tomatoes, because that can change the density of the salsa, and that means that the heat penetration is going to be different when you're canning it. And so you're not supposed to drain off the liquid when you make salsa recipes. You're supposed to leave it all in there. And so if you start with a paste tomato, it's going to be less liquidy to begin with, and that's kind of an advantage. This particular paste tomato is called San Marzano Ridorta. I originally got the seeds from Seeds of Italy, and they don't seem to have them available any longer, and I don't know if that's a permanent thing or if it's just that they're sold out and so they're not showing on the website. I've been working my way through the original packet of these for probably 6 or 7 years, and I'm almost out. They are available in some other locations. I really love this variety, and if you compare it to, this is the San Marzano tomato from Johnny's. This is San Marzano 2 from Johnny's. Look at the difference in the size. If you are canning a lot of tomatoes and most of the time you're going to be peeling them, guess which one takes a whole lot less work? This one, because this is like 3 or 4 of this. And so if you're peeling tomatoes, it's very nice to peel 1 of these instead of 4 of these. This is the first time with the Johnny's. I bought them because I couldn't get more seed for this one, and I wanted to trial a new variety. This is very productive. It's a nice squat plant, and it has so far produced quite a bit more fruit than this one. This tends to be a late season producer. However, you can see why I prefer this. Other heirloom type paste tomatoes that you'll often see, Olpoka is one. I have not had great luck with that. And then Amish paste is mentioned all the time for heritage tomatoes, for paste tomatoes. They are very similar to this. They're kind of like a bull's heart shaped tomato, big and round. I've tried growing Amish paste in 3 different climates. I tried to grow them in high elevation Colorado. I tried to grow them up in Spokane, Washington, which is it's higher than here, but considerably less than Colorado. And then I tried to grow them here in southeast Colorado, down in the Walla Walla area. I did not have luck in any 3 of those instances. It could be the seed source. Maybe I'd have better luck if I tried a different source for Amish paste, but I have never had good luck with them. So I really love the Ridorta. We also did a side-by-side taste test. I'll link to the blog post on that below, where I trialed a whole bunch of different paste tomatoes, and we tasted them side by side just to see which one tasted best just out of hand, and this one won hands down. So this is my favorite paste tomato by far, and I'm just going to walk you through this really simple recipe for salsa and give you some tips as I go. Let's get started. All right, I am going to double this recipe because I did make it a couple of days ago and it only made 3 pints, and I think I would like to make 6 pints. I have my Roma tomatoes in here, just getting them a good rinse. Tomatoes have something called tomato tar on them. And so in addition to the possibility of a bird that's flown by or perched on one of my tomato cages and pooped on something, there's also just a lot of tomato tar on these. just because that's naturally what they have. So giving everything a good rinse is definitely something you want to do. And then I'm just gonna I'm gonna chop everything in the food processor, but I'm gonna loosely chop things up now. Excuse my dirty dishes. I've got the dishwasher going, and so I don't have a good place to hide those. And these are the Roma tomatoes that I started in my greenhouse that I brought you along for back all the way in March. You gotta play the long game when you're growing tomatoes. So we started mid-March, and it is now right at the end of July. And right at the end of July, I'm just starting to get a decent amount of ripe tomatoes. I usually have a huge flush about the second week in August. And so this is just the very beginning of tomato season. New gardeners are often really surprised at how long it takes to get a ripe tomato, and they get green tomatoes and they get super excited, and then a couple of weeks go by and those tomatoes are still green and they're wondering, why aren't my tomatoes ripe yet? And the reality is it takes a long time to get ripe tomatoes. I'm just gonna start with these big guys. This green shoulder that you see on here, that's pretty typical. And it can be caused by a lot of different things, but in my case, I think it's just environmental. It can be a reaction to heat and sun. And even though I do have some shade cloth up on the south side of my tomatoes, I still tend to get some pretty good green shoulders on things. And it's harmless. As you can see, I'm just cutting it out. It doesn't tend to cook down or break down very easily, and so I tend to cut it off rather than leave it on. And then some of this other marking that you might be seeing on there, we do have a type of stink bug that will get into tomatoes and try to feed on them. The damage is really superficial, but it does do some. And so sometimes when you see just a little bit of hardening of the skin or discoloration of the skin that's really just almost skin deep, that's almost always, in my case, just a stink bug. So I'm sharing my harvest with everybody. So this recipe, I think, comes out of Canada. And because of that, it's actually in a weight measurement instead of a volume measurement, which I really prefer. And I need 1 kilogram. The recipe calls for 1 kilogram. I'm going to double everything, so I need 2 kilograms. So not okay. This bowl is 319. I have 1 kilogram, 264 grams. I need 319. So I probably need like 1 more small tomato here. Let's see, who wants to join the party? And you could go see this. This is blossom end rot. I don't get it a lot with my tomatoes just because I've figured out mostly how to prevent it. It's mostly an issue with watering. It's ultimately a calcium deficiency, but adding more calcium does not necessarily solve the problem because it's really the plant is having a hard time moving calcium around to where it needs it, and that's what causes that. So consistent watering is what's mostly important. I'm a little over there, but that's close enough. And it also is sometimes some varieties are a lot more prone to it. You can see that none of the rest of these and none of the other ones that I just processed have the blossom end rot. That's because these are a good variety for not having that. I do deep water every 3 days, and so that makes a big difference. Okay, so that is gonna go into our food processor. Calls for 1 medium onion. This is really more of a large onion. A medium onion will give you, I wanna say, a cup chopped is the typical measurement. An extra large onion will give you 2 cups chopped. So I'm just gonna see what this looks like when I get it cut up. These are Walla Walla sweet onions. You can use any kind of onion you like. It doesn't have to be a white onion or a yellow onion. It could be a red onion. Everything works. Whatever you have on hand, what you like the flavor of. These I did not grow. We're still a little ways out on my onions, but because I'm in Walla Walla, Washington, I can get Walla Walla onions pretty easily. They're nice and sweet. And I bought 20 pounds of organic seconds for 20 bucks, which was really nice. And again, I'm gonna do this in the food processor. That's probably about a cup. which is about what would be in one recipe. I'm doubling everything, so this is going to be about another cup. Almost all canning recipes have a lot of leeway built into them. That is something that people don't realize. And it's actually, for somebody who's really likes precision like I do, it can be really frustrating because they'll give you measurements that are so, nebulous. And you're like, well, what does that actually weigh? Or does that mean before or after you've cut the cores off of the tomatoes? So I like things that go by weight instead of volume, but they are built with a lot of leeway because they know there's going to be a lot of differences in terms of how finely people chop things and how they eyeball things and, how big is a medium onion. Your guess is as good as mine. So they're generally built with a very big safety margin. All right, this calls for 1 large jalapeno. My jalapenos are not particularly large. This is a ripe, a type of jalapeno called Hungarian black. And when it's ripe, it's red. This is a regular jalapeno. This is also red when it's ripe. Most people don't realize that jalapenos turn red when they're ripe. And if you've ever fallen in love with sriracha sauce is made from ripe red jalapenos. That's all they are. I like my peppers generally to be ripe rather than green, regardless of what color they turn when they're ripe, just because the flavor is a little sweeter. The nutrition is a little better. So I don't use a lot of green peppers, but I'm going to do a little bit of both here. And then because these are on the small side, these Hungarian blacks aren't particularly hot, so I'm going to just leave the seeds in. If you don't want more heat, you can take the seeds and the veins out. If you want it to be hotter, you can leave them in. And then the other big hint with any kind of canning that involves peppers is you can change out the type of pepper as long as you keep the volume approximately the same. So if I didn't want this to have any heat, I could use a bell pepper here that was just, maybe a quarter of a bell pepper to equal a jalapeno. If I wanted it to be hotter, I could use serranos, I could use habaneros, whatever you want, as long as it's about the same volume. Peppers are interchangeable in canning recipes, and that can be very handy if you're making something and you're short on something or you don't have the pepper that's called for. I'm going to need a half a cup of lime juice. Because I'm doubling this, I'm actually going to need a full cup of lime juice, or 8 ounces. And you will see some canning information that says do not use fresh, always use bottled on lemon juice or lime juice. The reality is fresh lemons and limes are more acidic than the canned stuff. And so the canned stuff is standardized, and they standardize it to a pH where if they add a little bit of water, it's cheaper for them. And so you can actually use fresh and it'll be just fine. I tend to like the taste of fresh citrus way better than I like the bottled stuff. There's something about the bottled stuff. I'm assuming they heat it. I don't know, but it's definitely a distinct taste that I can taste. And so I always use fresh if I can. And they're calling this Pico de Gallo because this is kind of a classic. If you were to just eat a fresh chopped Pico de Gallo in a restaurant, this is what it is. It's jalapenos, onions, tomatoes, and lime juice, and some salt and some garlic. So very simple. Not a lot of other flavorings. And Pico de Gallo means beak of the rooster. And it's named for that because it has a little bit of a bite to it. And so it should have some heat traditionally, although you certainly don't have to do that. I did get my bottled lime juice out just because I don't know if I have enough limes to make a whole cup of lime juice. We're almost to a cup. We're getting there. If you are the kind of person who composts, pick these labels off before you throw stuff into your compost. They do not decompose. I have sifted compost and found them over a year later. They never break down. And I actually got to tour a really big compost facility last year, and they did a lot of orchard fruit that had been tagged and then, didn't sell for whatever reason. And there were millions of sticky tags in the compost because they don't break down. Somebody needs to come up with a formula for putting labels on produce that actually breaks down over time. It seems like such a simple thing. So the extra lime here, I'm just gonna make myself a limeade because it's summer and I'm hot, and why not? Interesting, I just realized this recipe doesn't actually have garlic in it. I am gonna put a little bit of garlic in here. This is not gonna be enough to drastically change anything in terms of pH. And salsa without garlic just seems odd to me, so I'm gonna go ahead and put some in. All right, I'm just gonna run this garlic through my rasp grater so that it's nice and fine. It's just gonna dissolve into this salsa. We're just gonna chop this in our food processor. I did buy a new food processor. For those of you who have followed me for any length of time, you know that I had a different food processor that I really kind of hated. And during Amazon Prime Day, this one, which I actually have one of these upstairs in my commercial kitchen, was on sale for 44% off. So I got it for $133, and I decided that was worth doing. The one thing I don't like about it is that this feed tube is in the back instead of the front, which I think is just completely asinine. Makes no sense. When you're doing this and you're dumping and you're gonna go back and do more, it's helpful to stick your finger in the bottom of this and hang on to that blade. It will keep you from accidentally dropping the blade into your food. And you want this to be somewhat chunky. You don't want it to be completely pulped. Again, this is another part of why these recipes are very forgiving, because, you know, one person's chop is not going to be another person's chop in terms of what they want, and then that's going to change how things measure. And you can see I've got some bigger pieces that are on the sides, and I'm going to leave those in there. And you can see this isn't super juicy, but that's because we're using paste tomatoes and not standard tomatoes. And you can hand chop this or use one of those mechanical choppers. Doesn't have to be a food processor. And especially because this isn't a huge recipe, that can be a nice way to go. All right, I'm gonna put my garlic in there. I'm gonna add my lime juice. And this is gonna make it quite a bit more juicy. And that's just the price you pay for having a shelf-stable salsa. And then we're gonna need some salt for sure. So again, because I'm doubling this recipe, I want 2 teaspoons of salt. This is Redmond's real salt. You can use canning and pickling salt. You can use sea salt. You just want something that doesn't have any iodine to speak of. So not regular table salt. And even if you use regular table salt, it wouldn't be the end of the world. It just discolors things because of the iodine. And things that you can play with on this, you could leave the salt out altogether and it wouldn't change anything. You could add, you know, a teaspoon of sugar if you wanted to, and that wouldn't be any big deal. You can do small tweaks to the spices in canning recipes without affecting their safety. And so if I taste this, which I'm going to in a minute here, and I think it needs a little bit more salt, I can add that. The other thing I haven't put in here yet is some cilantro. And this is the cilantro that we froze a couple of weeks ago. I have a really quick little video on this saying don't dry cilantro, freeze it. And this is why I do this, because right now all of the cilantro in my garden is bolting and sending up flower stalks and isn't really good for eating. And it hardly has any leaves left on it. It's all just about the flower. And so having some that is frozen for recipes like this is really nice. And you can just break off a chunk. Okay, so it calls for 2 tablespoons. I'm doubling the recipe, which means a 1/4 cup. I think my 1/4 cup measuring spoon is in the dishwasher. But just eyeballing that, that's about 2 tablespoons. That's about 2 tablespoons. We're just gonna call that good. Give that a stir and let that start heating. And we really just need to bring this up to a nice full boil. It's not a super long cooking time. I did want to give this a taste before it gets too heated up. That's good. It's really acidic with that lime juice. It's a lot of lime. And they put a lot of lime in here because the peels are still on the tomatoes. So there's going to be an extra safety issue because of the skins. And so they wanted to really make sure that they were covering their bases on the acid that was in this. So it's got a pretty good lime kick, but I happen to really like lime, so not a problem. It does feel like it has enough heat, and it feels like it has enough salt. And when you open a jar of this and taste it, if it doesn't feel like it has enough heat, you can always just add some hot sauce to it. People often say, you know, they'll make a salsa recipe and they'll post online in some of the groups, does anybody have a good salsa recipe? I don't like the one I have. And they don't say why they don't like the one they have. And, you know, if you don't like the recipe that you're cooking, you need to think about what it is that is not working for you. Does it not have enough oniony savoriness to it? Is it too acidic? Is it not enough tomato? You can't increase the onion and the pepper in a recipe that's tested, but you could easily increase the tomato because that's where the pH is coming from in a lot of cases. And so you could cut down or add extra of the tomatoes and probably not have any real issues. But if you don't like something, think about what it is that you don't like, and then think about, you know, are there safe ways that I can tweak this recipe and make it still work in terms of the seasonings that are in it. All right, I put a little bit of vinegar in here. We have hard water, we're on well water, and it will leave a film on everything if I don't put a little vinegar in the pot. So a little vinegar in the pot, and I'm just gonna bring that to a boil. There's our cilantro chunk breaking up there. And I get this recipe from the Healthy Canning website. One of the things I love about that website is they reference every recipe that they use and tell you where they got it, and they will not post something unless it's been tested. This was kind of an obscure source, and I'll put it on the screen. It wasn't something that is common that most people have in their kitchen, which is why this isn't a really well-known recipe. But everything that they do is from tested recipes, and so it's really nice when you're learning to can to know that everything on there is going to be safe, tested, bomb-proof. So while everything is coming to a boil over there, I'm going to do a little quick kitchen cleanup. All right, this has come to a simmer. We need to simmer this for 3 minutes. I did just realize the recipe calls for seeding the tomatoes. That's probably to reduce the liquid a little bit. I did not seed these. It is definitely not a safety issue to seed tomatoes. And interestingly, America's Test Kitchen did some testing a while back and showed that a lot of the flavor of tomato is in the seeds. And so I usually leave them in if I have an option because I like good tomato flavor and I don't necessarily want less flavor in my product, whatever it is I'm making. And so I didn't seed these. I think I did on the first time I made this, and I just completely forgot to do it this time. But again, not a safety issue, just a slight, probably texture issue. So we want to simmer this once it's come to a boil for 3 minutes, and then we're going to put it in our jars. So this recipe is 1/2 inch headspace, and 1/2 inch headspace is right to the top of this jar rim. So that gives you a visual on that. You can also measure it. There are handy little measuring tools. I feel like there's no way that's going to make 6 pints. All right, tribe, let me show you how to rescue a recipe when you measure incorrectly. So the original recipe called for 1 kilogram or 2 pounds of tomatoes, and I was doubling the recipe, and somehow I only measured out 1 kilogram of tomatoes, and it should have been 2 kilograms of tomatoes. So I went and got more tomatoes. Thankfully, I have more tomatoes. And because this has already been cooked, I'm gonna heat this up, bring it to a boil, then pour all of this back in here and stir it together and put it in the jars. So yeah, thankfully, it's a dead giveaway when you have like half as much stuff as you expect to have. Yeah, I should have known, but there you go. So it's always a good idea when you're doubling a recipe to write it out as a doubled recipe, because it's really easy to do that. And particularly because it was in kilograms for some reason, that really messed me up. Thankfully, that was something that was easy to recover from. When I'm doing this kind of thing, sometimes stuff likes to float and you'll get a lot of liquid at the bottom, or a lot of stuff likes to sink and you'll get a lot of liquid at the top. So as I'm filling the jars, I like to go in from the bottom and up just to make sure that I'm getting a good mix of what's in there. This ladle is 6 ounces. I have an 8-ounce one as well. It's nice when they're big enough that you don't have to fill the jar quite so many times. And I did not preheat my jars. You do run the risk of cracking a jar, especially if there's a hairline crack in it already and you don't know it's there, by putting hot liquid into a room temperature jar. I like to live on the dangerous side of life, but it is something to be aware of. And the general rule of thumb is hot jars should go into hot liquid, cold jars should go into cold liquid. Like, because the sauce is hot, you want your pot that the jars are going into to also be boiling. Like, you wouldn't want to fill that up with cold tap water and then stick your hot jars in there, or you'll run the risk of shock. I'm guessing I'm gonna not get quite 6 jars here. Yeah, that's definitely not another pint. But I'll just stash this one in the fridge and we'll eat it fresh. The headspace that they call for in jars, it is a safety thing, but it's also a quality thing. If you've got a big oxygen airspace where you don't fill the jars all the way up, things tend to oxidize and discolor over time because of all that air. They also, a lot of times, it won't pull a good vacuum. I once did a holiday show where there were people there selling homemade canned goods without any kind of license. The organizer of the show had no idea, and so didn't realize what they needed to ask for. And, you know, if I thought that the canned goods were totally safe, that's kind of a buyer beware thing. It wasn't that big of a deal. But one of the things that really made me nuts was a lot of the jars weren't even all the way filled. And it was just a bit terrifying. And then they had some things like pumpkin, and there is no way to can pumpkin at home safely. And they had like a pumpkin butter. And I was there selling my own jams, and I'm fully licensed. And I kept thinking, somebody's going to get sick and they're not going to remember where they bought this canned product from, particularly because the place that was selling stuff didn't even have like a good signage with a business name. The jars didn't have any contact information on them. A lot of times they didn't even have a good product listing. It just said something like, you know, pea, and you were assuming that was peach jam, but you didn't know. It was like they just cleaned out their pantry. It was so crazy. And I wrote quite the letter to the organizer when I was done and said, this is unacceptable, and you need to never do that again without asking somebody for their actual business license to make sure that they're licensed to sell what they're selling, because it's going to come back on you as the event organizer if something goes wrong. But, you know, hey, let's clean out our pantry and just bring everything down to the holiday bazaar and sell it. It was quite the show. All right, so we got 5.5 out of this. And I'm just gonna very gently. And in my experience, I've occasionally lost jars to having them break in the canner. Absolutely 100% of the time, user error. And when they're gonna break, you almost always hear it just as you put the jar into the canner. You'll hear a pop. And every time it's happened to me, it has been the bottom of the jar has broken off all the way around in almost a perfect circle. So they rarely crack up the side. If it does happen to you, I mean, you can stop, take everything out, rinse it all, start over, reheat everything. But the reality is the stuff that's on the outside floating around in that canner is not getting inside your jars. And so it really isn't a safety risk. It's gross because there's all kinds of stuff floating around in your canner because the jar broke. But the other jars that didn't break are 100% fine. And so I will often just continue, especially if it's a short canning cycle, like it's only 10 minutes or something. I will just continue on and then rinse everything once the jars are cool. But it is heartbreaking. And every time it happens to me, it's never something that took a really short amount of time to put into a canner. It's always like barbecue sauce where I literally spent, 2 days cooking down tomatoes and straining tomatoes and adding all kinds of other things and then pureeing everything. And, it's always something that took forever to get to the point where it's in the canner to have it break. It's just heartbreaking. So yeah, but the biggest thing is heat shock. So don't put cold jars in hot water. Don't put hot jars in cold water. And it's really something I was oblivious to for probably the first couple of years that I was canning. I just didn't even think about it. All right, I am going to need a little bit more water here just because I'm a jar short. We're going to let that come back to a full rolling boil, and then we'll start our timer. These process for 15 minutes. And by the way, I did go through the steps. Everything else I doubled. I just didn't double the tomatoes. So the rest of those measurements were correct. And the recipe is going to be down below in the description. So I'll put the original recipe in the description, not what I did, and you can take it from there. All right, so we're going to bring this to a full rolling boil. Then we'll start our timer for 15 minutes. And I'll come back when these are done and ready to come out of the processor. All right, you guys, it's been 15 minutes, and then I turned the water off, or turned the heat off and let it sit for another 5. And that just helps ensure a good seal. Don't forget and leave them sitting in hot water, though. That can lead to off-tasting product. And so if you're gonna let them sit, only let them sit for 5 minutes. Be sure to set a timer. And there you have it. So we got 5 pints of Pico de Gallo out of about 4 pounds of tomatoes. Beautiful. I like this recipe because it's small. It's just nice to be able to do this. It seems like a whole lot less effort than my normal salsa recipe to be able to make this, on an evening when I'm also cooking some dinner and doing some other things in the kitchen. So give this one a try. It's tasty, it's easy, it's a good beginner recipe because you don't have to peel the tomatoes, and definitely worth your time. Good morning, homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. So it's the following morning. I managed to mostly put my kitchen back together, which was kind of a exploded disaster. Here's our finished Pico de Gallo. Remember, when you're storing your canned goods, you take the ring off, and that way